So tonight we have Mel Asher here to talk about native plant selection and maintenance. Mel was born and raised in Michigan and obtained her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology from Michigan State University, and then a Master's of Science in Wildlife Habitat Management from Texas A&M University. She moved to Washington State in 2004, was a rangeland ecologist with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. 2010, she switched into the private sector. Mel worked with BFI Native Seeds as a restoration ecologist for 11 years and is the new owner of Derby Canyon Natives as of January 2022. Her work includes native seed collection, native plant propagation, vegetation monitoring, plant surveys, restoration, project planning, and implementation. Mel, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kirk. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So as Kirk mentioned, I'm going to be talking about native plant selection and maintenance, really geared towards the home landscape. Just a little bit about Derby Canyon Natives and BFI Native Seeds before I go forward. Derby Canyon Natives, as many of you know, is a local plant nursery here in Shaston, Washington. It was started in the early 2000s by Ted Alway, and it's grown steadily over the years. And we currently have about 80 to 100,000 plants in various stages of production, from germinating seedlings to 10-gallon sized trees and everything in between. We have over 150 different species in multiple different container sizes. We sell a lot of our plants to wholesale customers like agencies, NGOs, other nurseries, but our retail sales have been growing steadily over the last few years and will hopefully continue to grow. So hopefully we'll see some of you all at the nursery this spring. BFI Native Seeds is my former employer, but I'm going to be kind of maintaining some ties there for the foreseeable future. And BFI is a seed production company based in Warden, and BFI grows over, they've grown over 700 different varieties of grasses and wildflower seeds over the last 22 years since the company was started in 2022, or I'm sorry, 2000. So with that, I just wanted to kind of quickly define what a native plant is for those of you who are just, totally new to this idea. I found a great definition from NRCS, and they define a native plant as a plant that is a part of the balance of nature that is developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. The geographic context of this definition is what's really critical. So in other words, a plant native to, say, the Central Plains of the US that didn't occur in Eastern Washington prior to European settlement would not be considered native to our area. And that's important for just in general being adapted to the area and being able to thrive without much maintenance. So why would you want to use native plants in either a landscape or wildland planting, as opposed to a lot of the plants that are readily available from garden centers? Well, I've got a couple of pretty big reasons to share. First of all, when native plants are sited appropriately, they can create very low maintenance landscapes. They require less water, low or no fertilizer, etc. And secondly, native plants are an essential part of the food web in any given area. So they provide habitat for native insects, and which are a primary food source for many birds and other wildlife. There's some great books written by Doug Tallamy, for any of you interested in reading further. He's an author and entomologist, and there's a lot of great webinars of his online that can be viewed as well, where he kind of digs into the science of this. I highly recommend them. So just as a quick overview of my presentation today, I'm going to cover how to select native plants for your site based on moisture availability and soils. So in native plantings, it's best to match the moisture requirements of the plants with the moisture at your given site, unless you're interested and able to irrigate for the life of the planting. And many people will do so. I'm going to briefly talk about native wildflowers that are hosts for pollinators and other beneficial insects. And Betsy Dudash is going to be digging into that a lot deeper in her presentation next week. So a lot of the observations that I've made on pollinators and native plant hosts is based on BFI's native flower seed production plots in Warden. So for example, this is aspen fleabane or showy fleabane from BFI's seed production plot, which is a phenomenal pollinator host we found. I'm also going to talk about the various plant materials that are available and commonly used for native plantings. I'm going to talk a little bit about genetic provenance, or the geographic origin of plant materials, and whether or not this is an important consideration in any given project. I'm going to cover the planting process, including timing and methods. And finally, I'll talk about long-term maintenance, including irrigation, fertilization, weeding, etc. So we've got a lot to get through. I'm going to be taking pauses 3 times throughout the presentation to answer questions before moving on to different sections. So you'll have a chance to ask questions into the chat box. So the first critical site step for determining which native plants will work best on your site is to determine the moisture availability of your site and what kind of native habitat it would support. And then you can select the native plants that have similar moisture needs within that habitat. So this is a map that I created of the Wenatchee Valley and surrounding areas using a tool developed by U.S. Forest Service geneticists and called the Provisional Seed Zone mapping. And this is available online for anyone to use. And there's web mapping on for PC and for mobile. Kurt can paste a link into the chat for anybody who's interested in looking at this, but this tool basically maps similar climates based on temperatures, and it's kind of like the USDA plant hardiness zone, but with the added element of precipitation or rainfall and snowfall, which is critical when you want to have a low irrigation landscape. So you can see from this map that most of the Wenatchee Valley and western Douglas County falls into an area that's classified as semi-arid. And there's some small patches of even arid, even drier, hotter climate towards Rock Island and then east through the Columbia Basin, including where I used to live in Ephrata. So native vegetation in upland sites in this arid and semi-arid zone would typically be shrub-steppe habitat. And then heading west up the Wenatchee River Valley or higher elevations into the foothills, the climate becomes semi-humid and transitions to woodland habitat. Moister areas within either of these zones, say along a riparian area or in a draw bottom, would support moist site or riparian species. So those are the kind of the 3 main habitat types that I'm going to be kind of classifying all of our plants into shrub steppe, woodland, or riparian. And the moisture requirements of these 3 zones differs widely. So using this map, or just looking at the plant communities that surround your house, you can predict what the appropriate plant community that can grow without irrigation at your site. But of course, if you live in an area that's, say, shrub steppe and you want to grow woodland species, it can be done, but irrigation would likely be required indefinitely, not just to get the plants established. Okay. So just a quick overview of the different plants within the shrub steppe zone. There's a couple of shrub species that are really common, and they are big sagebrush, which is variable height from 3 to 12 feet of maturity. Most of what you see is 3 feet or less, but in certain areas and draw bottoms with extra moisture, it can get up to 12 feet tall and look kind of like a short tree, which is pretty amazing. Everybody is probably familiar with big sagebrush that's lived in Eastern Washington. But in case you're not, this species has kind of grayish, pungent foliage and inconspicuous flowers that emerge in the late summer or early fall. Another really common shrub is bitterbrush. This typically gets up to no more than 6 feet tall. And in the late spring, bitterbrush will be covered by small yellow blooms. And it's a really important deer forage. So definitely not a deer-resistant plant for those of you interested in that. Particularly, it's used by deer in the late winter. So it's an important habitat species for that. So both these shrub species prefer full sun and have very low moisture requirements. So they would be appropriate within the shrub steppe zone without irrigation. So moving on to grasses. In shrub steppe, most native grasses have what's called a clumping growth form or bunch grass. They're bunch grass type. The most common grass and the official Washington state grass is called blue bunch wheatgrass. And this grass usually gets to about 2 feet tall. And it grows during the cool part of the year. So growth typically starts in the late winter, early spring. And the plant will begin to go dormant usually by July. And so it's dormant through the summer and sometimes into the fall. Another really common shrub steppe grass is Sandberg's bluegrass. This is a short statured grass that typically is less than 1 foot tall, greens up in the fall, and then grows typically through April or early May before going dormant in the summer. And then on shrub steppe sites that are slightly more mesic, for example, northerly aspects, Idaho fescue is a really common grass. This species typically has kind of a grayish green foliage, can grow up to 2 feet tall, and like blue bunch wheatgrass, goes dormant in the early summer. And there is an enormous diversity of wildflowers native to shrub steppe, too much to cover today. A few of my favorites that are both easy to grow in a home landscape and establish well in restoration projects include snow buckwheat, which has grayish foliage and white or pink flowers. It's a really important pollinator host because it actually flowers late in the summer or even into early fall, which is pretty rare for most shrub steppe species. Another favorite species is Lewis flax, which you can see here. Typically gets about to 2 feet tall. It's very drought tolerant, and it produces these showy blue flowers in the early summer. Fleabane daisies are a really great shrub steppe flower to grow. This particular fleabane daisy is called shaggy fleabane daisy, and it's pretty short stature, typically only 12 inches tall or less, and it flowers in the late spring. And again, these species typically need full sun, but minimal or no additional water. And then many of them will turn brown and die back by midsummer, and will continue to reemerge each spring. So at higher elevations within the Wenatchee River Valley or in areas with additional moisture from runoffs or creeks, native plant communities transition to woodlands or forest. In woodlands, trees and a higher diversity of shrubs occur naturally, including the ubiquitous ponderosa pine, pictured here, which grows to over 100 feet at maturity. Other common trees include Douglas fir or even grand fir in more humid areas. Numerous shrubs, common ones include woods rose, snowberry, elderberry, currants, and many more occur in the understory beneath the trees. So most of the woodland shrub species can thrive in full sun or partial shade, but they generally do not do well with full shade. Within the woodland zone, there's a lot of rhizomatous grasses that become common, including, along with some of the bunchgrasses found in shrub-steppe. Pine grass is one of my favorites. It primarily grows vegetatively, so without producing seed, until seed production is stimulated by fire. And this is a picture of a pine grass stand that's flowering with seed heads post fire, as you can see from the blackened trees. Another common understory grass is blue wild rye, and it's also spreading or rhizomatous. And this is a picture from BFI's seed production farm in Warden. This grass grows up to 5 feet tall, and BFI grows a lot of blue wild rye. It's probably our most common species grown for production, and it's used on a lot of forest restoration projects such as road decommissionings or following logging disturbance. Again, wildflower diversity is incredibly high in this zone. Just to name a few of my favorites that are relatively easy to grow, there's showy or aspen fleabane daisy. I've been growing this one at my house in Ephrata for the last 10 years, very low maintenance. This species gets up to 2 feet tall and has showy purple ray flowers through the late spring and early summer. Blanket flower, another important pollinator host, grows up to 2 feet tall, flowers into the late summer. And I just wanted to mention that unlike most shrub-steppe plants, woodland plants may stay green through the summer or have a shorter summer dormancy period. And then the final grouping of plants, riparian species, I would classify as having moderate to high moisture needs. So these are plants that you would select if you had riparian habitat on your property, say along a creek, or if you wanted to irrigate throughout the growing season. So riparian species include most willows, cottonwoods, and water birch. And they're primarily used in habitat restoration projects. And this is a picture of cottonwood, which grows up to 100 feet tall. Full sun to partial shade requirements for most of these species. It just kind of depends on the particular species. So that was a general overview of the 3 different native habitats found in our area and the moisture requirements of each. But how would you as a landowner find out what an individual species needs in terms of moisture requirement and what zone it occurs in? So one of the best sources I found is a publication from the Columbia Basin chapter of the Washington Native Plant Society. And it's available online at an address that Kurt can type into the chat box. I've copied a screenshot of one page of this guide here, and you'll note that there's a soil type column highlighted with a red line. So it's called soil type, but functionally this provides information on moisture requirements, with D for dry, M for mesic or moist, and A for adaptable, meaning these plants could grow in either dry or moist sites. So this list covers many of the native plants that are commercially available from plant nurseries in central Washington. And another good source is the plant nurseries themselves. This is a screenshot from Derby Canyon Natives website on a page listing the types of shrubs that we have available. And there's a column titled Drought Tolerant, which very drought tolerant species such as rabbit brush are indicated by 2 X's, kind of moderately drought tolerant just with 1 X, and then riparian species such as the red osier dogwood with no X's at all because it is not drought tolerant. It's a riparian species that requires moisture. This website has a ton of information on it in addition to soil moisture, such as mature height of each plant, sun requirements, flower colors, etc. There's also links to the Burke herbarium page on each of these to show you guys some nice pictures of each plant. So beyond determining moisture needs and requirements, another critical step is determining the soil texture of your site. So this is really critical for restoration projects, which will have minimal irrigation and maintenance, meaning that the species selected have to be adapted to the soils and climate in order to persist long term. In landscaping, if minimal irrigation is planned, soils are really critical as well. Primarily because soil texture can influence the aridity or dryness of a site. So sandy or cobbly soils have large soil particles and therefore larger pore spaces between the particles, meaning these soils drain faster, hold less moisture, and make sites functionally drier than a nearby site with, say, loamy or clayey soils. So my favorite way to determine the soil texture of your site is the jar test. And there's lots of great instructions for this on the internet, but it's pretty simple. You get a quart-sized mason jar and you place a half a cup of soil in with a few cups of water, shake it well, and let the layers settle out. The sand, silt, and clay components of the soil will settle out at different speeds, and you can measure the height of each layer to determine the composition and therefore soil type. And Kurt can paste a link to this test in the chat box, as well as a guide for kind of determining the composition after you've done the test. So the same Washington Native Plant Society document I referenced 2 slides back also lists some common shrub-steppe species that occur in different soil types. So for those of you that have very sandy or very rocky soils on your property and want to plant adapted low maintenance natives, there's a list for each of those soil types on this document, which I found extremely handy. And then one final important consideration for plant selection is planning your landscape to support pollinators and other beneficial insects. And so in general, the best approach includes planting species that flower at different times of the year. So species that flower in the spring, summer, and into early fall. There's lots of good resources out there that discuss pollinators, and Betsy will be going into this more next week. But the Xerces Society is a great source for online information. I have this, BFI has produced this publication, which we can make available if anybody would like a copy of this. We can email that to you. This was put together by Kelsey Prickett, who managed BFI's forward production fields for 10 years and developed a feel for which species were hosting which pollinators. So, and there's a there's a section on bloom timing as well as color and water requirements. So that's the end of the first section, plant selection. So if there's any questions, I can pause here and answer them before moving on to the rest of the webinar.
And feel free to put those in the chat.
So Kirk, we want people to type their questions into the chat box.
Yeah, I mean, if we can try just unmuting yourself if it doesn't get too crazy, that works for me.
Okay, I see somebody's got their hand raised, so.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Try it with them.
Yeah, Elaine?
So I was just wondering what makes a good plant for butterflies?
What about the plant?
Yeah, so are they the same type of plants that attract pollinators, or is there something, or they have cherry blossoms, or what attracts butterflies?
On the Derby Canyon website, there's actually a section that lists butterfly species.
Okay.
And it is a little different. For example, like the milkweeds are a great monarch butterfly host. And that's, not necessarily due to the flowers, it's due to the, the structure of the plant and laying. I feel like that question is probably a little bit outside of my scope of expertise, but I will say that they can be different. And check out the Derby Canyon Natives website. There's a link for all of the beneficial insects, and Ted Alway put together a great table on which native plant species host which native butterflies. It's a great resource.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And hopefully you'll be able to join next week when Betsy's, that's her specific talk. It's about pollinators.
Yes.
And Mel, I don't know if you saw in the chat also, what would be a good native ground cover plant?
Great question. One of the most commonly used ground covers is kinnikinnick. So Arctostaphylos, that's technically a woodland species. So if you're in shrub-steppe, it might require a little bit of irrigation to keep it happy and thriving. But if you're in kind of the upper valley, it should do pretty well on its own. Wild strawberry is another decent ground cover that we grow a lot of at Derby Canyon. And there's a couple other ceanothus species, like prostrate ceanothus is a decent one. There's three, I think, that are really commonly used for ground cover. So yeah, any other questions?
Vic, does that answer your question? If you want to add more to it, feel free to unmute and jump in.
Does that work for replacing grass and also with pets?
I wouldn't plant kinnikinnick in an area with very high traffic. It's got woody stems that could be crushed. So in that situation, you could plant like a native turf mix, which is going to be a little bit more resistant to traffic, but would still likely require some irrigation. And so the native I call them turf mixes, but it's basically native species grow that are sown at a really high density. And so instead of kind of creating that bunch grass clump form, it looks more like a contiguous lawn. And so it's a little bit more drought tolerant than a typical, like say Kentucky bluegrass lawn, but still would require some irrigation, particularly in like the lower valley area.
And how about deer resistant options?
That's a really tough one. You know, are any plants truly deer resistant? Deer seem like they will eat anything in a given situation. You know, some of the species that we found to be less preferred by deer include like the thorny species, like woods rose, yarrow, so the really pungent species that have obviously developed an adaptation to deterring herbivory, like sagebrush, any of the really pungent smelling species. There's actually a page on the Derby Canyon website that addresses the deer resistant species specifically too, if you'd like to log on to that and read more about it. The list is a little bit more comprehensive than what I just discussed here. But yeah, in general, thorny species or very pungent smelling species is about as deer resistant as you can get.
And when's a good time of year to plant?
I'm going to hold that one because we'll be talking about that one.
All right. Any other questions before we move on? Is Derby Canyon open for retail?
We're going to be opening on April 1st and 2nd. So Friday and Saturday. And we'll be open for retail sales 1 weekend a month through the spring. And if that doesn't work for your schedule, just shoot me an email and I can, you know, we can put a phone in order that you can come pick up.
Any other questions? Great. If we'll keep going, but certainly put in questions into the chat if you have some, so we don't forget them. So
I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit because it looks like it's already almost 7:40. So next section is going to be talking about the plant materials that you're going to be using in your native planting. And so there's two basic types of plant materials. There's seed and there's live plants. Seeds are generally appropriate for larger scale projects, so larger than, say, a 5,000 square foot backyard. Some species that do really well from seed include grasses. Most grasses do really well from seed. This is a handful of grass seed here from a 50-pound bag. Forbs and shrub seeds often have seed dormancy issues. So they can be a little bit more challenging to use by the layman. And so forbs and shrubs, or wildflowers and shrubs, are typically planted as live plants. Live plants, you can also, use live plants more effectively on kind of small or medium scale projects. And again, with species that are more challenging to transplant, established by seeds, such as forbs and shrubs. So if you are going to use seed, it's a little bit more, it requires a little bit more site preparation work. Weed control, good bare soil as depicted here. And so when the seed is broadcasted onto the soil, well, you need really good seed to soil contact. So most native grasses that are seeded should be covered with around 1/4 to 1/2 inch of soil, not left on the surface. And In restoration projects, we do what's called a fallow, or basically keeping the site bare for 2 years, generally prior to seeding, and that's just to deplete the weed seed bank and control the existing plants that are on the site in order to reduce the competition for a newly established grass seeds. Live plants need a lot less site preparation and weed control because the plants are just larger and more competitive. So definitely something to consider when you're making your choice on plant selection. The Native Plant Society of Washington has a great web source for the various nurseries and seed growers in Washington state, and the website listed here. So yeah, and they just updated that this spring. So hopefully should have all up-to-date information on the various sources for native plants and seed. So, and Kurt, can you paste that link into the chat box for anybody?
Yep, it's just put it in.
Thank you. So, and I just wanted to kind of briefly talk about genetic provenance before we move on from plant materials. So, genetic provenance, basically geographic location that specific plant material was originally collected from. And in restoration work, it's pretty critical to use appropriately collected materials, just because you expect those plants to persist for decades with little or no active management. So again, for restoration projects, for low maintenance native plantings, we use the U.S. Forest Service's provisional seed zone map to determine the seed zone of our planting site and try to match that to the extent possible for plant materials that we've purchased. Obviously, in home landscaping, the genetic origin of plant materials is less critical, but still something to consider. So, you know, matching the annual precipitation of a site is not critical if you can irrigate, but temperatures, in particular winter low temps, can vary widely across the state and affect the hardiness of any given plant stock. So this is the range of Saskatoon serviceberry, one of the commonly planted kind of taller shrubs in our area. And you can see that it grows all over the Pacific Northwest, from central to western Washington. And so, as you can imagine, the cold hardiness of serviceberries grown in western Washington could be significantly different than those in our area, where we have much colder winter temps. So definitely something to consider as you're buying your native plant materials. It's best to shop as locally as possible. So that was a really quick section. Are there any questions specifically on plant materials? After this, I'm going to move on and talk about the actual planting process. Okay, I don't see any questions, Kurt. Should we move on?
Yeah, I don't see any either, so let's
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead and move on.
All right, so this last section is going to cover the planting process. Timing is really critical for native plantings, particularly when there's not going to be any irrigation. For restoration projects, we target the dormant season for planting and seeding. And you can see my colleague Linda unrolling some small grass plugs to use on a small restoration project. You can see how bundled up she is. So, you know, dormant plantings occur typically in the cold season, late fall through winter, when temperatures freeze at night, but the soils are still pliable enough for planting. And this allows plants to kind of get through transplant shock during the cold time of the year and to grow substantial root mass before the hot summer months, when many of these species just want to go dormant. So in the Wenatchee Valley, the dormant season is typically late October through February or even March at higher elevations. But with irrigation or even occasional supplemental water, the planting window can be extended. Ideally, planting still would not occur during the hot summer months of July or August. And in fact, Derby Canyon is generally closed for retail sales at that time of year, just because so few people are interested in planting during the heat, and it's just not a good idea for establishing plants. Seeding can also be done a little bit outside of the dormant window, but it's most successful when it's cold, just because seed kind of in the kind of top layer on the surface of the soil is just really susceptible to drying out with the high winds and, you know, extreme sunshine that we often get in this area in the spring. It's just very challenging to keep the seeds moist enough to germinate. Plant spacing can vary widely depending on what you want your site to look like, what other landscaping features you have. I've included some target spacing here that we mainly use in restoration projects, where we consider, you know, 50% mortality to be pretty normal. So grasses and wildflowers, you know, typically go between 2 to 3 feet apart, shrubs between 3 and 6 feet, and trees between 8 and 12 feet. But again, it depends on the particular species and what you're looking for at your site. With sites, if your site is going to have minimal irrigation or maintenance, you're going to want to allow for some significant mortality and plan at a higher density initially. So the method, it's basically the same as for any landscaping plant. Basically, you dig a hole to at least the same depth as your container, and you place the plant in the hole such that the root crown or base of the stem is right at soil level. And then you backfill, ideally without any large rocks, and compact the soil lightly with your hand or light foot pressure. And then if possible, create a watering basin around the plant by forming a 2-inch berm, at least 1 foot in diameter. And then water the plant in well, using enough water to thoroughly wet the planting hole. Fertilization is not super critical if you've got decent topsoil at your site. You know, if you're at a new housing development where a lot of the topsoil has been scraped off, a little bit of slow release fertilizer or compost. The compost can be mixed into the planting hole, and the slow release fertilizer will typically just go on the surface. That can be helpful, particularly if your soil is depleted. But again, not critical if you've got decent soils that have been undisturbed for a long period of time. We don't use fertilizers at all on restoration projects, even on really poor soils, just because in general, natives are adapted to really low fertility soils. And so, yeah, compost if the site is very degraded, but otherwise the needs here are pretty minimal. But we've come to the realization in recent years that mulching is probably the most critical step in the native planting, particularly if you are looking at a low maintenance landscape. So mulching reduces competition from weeds, meaning you have less weeding to do right around the plant, and it reduces soil moisture loss. So we really like bark mulch or hog fuel mulch. because it's biodegradable and you don't have to go back and remove like landscape fabric squares several years after, after the fact. And the guidelines we typically use are about 2 to 3 5-gallon buckets for like a large shrub or tree. And you're looking for like a 2 to 3 foot diameter circle with the mulch 3 to 4 inches deep. And yeah, that's going to reduce competition from weeds and really help retain moisture right around the base of the plant, which will help with survival. A little bit about protection from animals. This is super critical if you've got heavy browse pressure in your area. The most foolproof method is of course fencing. We've used these Vexar tubes here on the right hand side of the screen for really small plants, but I think the largest size those come in is an 18-inch diameter. So plants pretty quickly grow out of those. And so they need to be fenced at least until they get above the browse line, which is considered to be about 5 feet tall. Irrigation. So there's 3 main approaches to consider for irrigation. So first, plants that may only need occasional extra water could be watered by hand, shown here. But I really prefer using an installed system, particularly for plants that are going to need to be regularly watered throughout the summer. Drip or micro sprinkler emitter systems are my personal favorite. And one critical thing to consider is to group your plants with similar water needs together so that you can change the frequency of watering to the same station to kind of fit that particular water need for those plants. So in other words, don't plant a willow that's going to need to be watered throughout the summer right next to a blue bunch wheatgrass that's going to want to go dormant and won't want any water, after July. So drip, micro sprinkler preferred. Of course, broadcast irrigation with larger sprinklers is always an option. But I try to discourage that with the exception of like a native turf lawn. And that's just because of the tendency of weeds to be watered just as much as the natives are, and the weed pressure that develops when you're doing that sort of broadcast irrigation. Irrigation is usually most critical in the first year of establishing a planting, and then after that, assuming that you've selected your plants appropriately for your site and they won't need irrigation, it can be tapered off and then even discontinued. So maintenance should be fairly minimal. I like to just, get in a regular monitoring schedule to check for, good moisture basically during the first growing season. And then after that, it should be fairly minimal. Shrub-steppe plants will likely go dormant in the summer. If you give them, a shot of water once per week, it can keep them green longer. And then it also can increase the flowering period, but you can very easily overwater shrub-steppe plants. So that's something that you'll won't be able to continue throughout the whole summer. And then, of course, weeding around the base of the plant is important to reduce competition for the soil moisture and nutrients, and maintaining the browse protection until the plants are at least 5 feet tall. So just a few final thoughts in summary, and just to kind of summarize what I've been talking about. Plant selection should be based, of native plants should be based on the moisture requirements and whether the landowners desire to irrigate their landscape over the long term. And there's a lot of different sources and experts available to help with plant selection. I highly recommend connecting with the Washington Native Plant Society, for which there is a local chapter, as well as local nurseries and seed vendors with any questions. Mulching is the secret key for low maintenance, in my opinion, really critical to do. And beyond that, the long-term maintenance needs for most natives is pretty minimal. You can clip them back, the dead growth back in the fall, just to beautify, keep them looking clean, but it's really not critical. They can persist without that. So with that, I will take any final questions. And I also have my contact information here, as well as a link, a website for both Derby Canyon Natives and BFI Native Seeds. So are there any final questions?
Mel, are you seeing the chat?
I am. So what are the consequences of overwatering shrub-steppe plants? So one of the species that I've overwatered the most is bitterbrush. And it actually grows so fast that the trunk splits. It gets too much growth, and the trunk will split and it will break, and basically, yeah, it'll kill the plant. So there's a few shrub-steppe species like bitterbrush that just are not, they're meant to be very slow growing species, and if you add water, they just don't keep up with that growth. The structure of the plant doesn't keep up with that growth, and they tend to break. I think that's one of the most common ones. There's some other species that, like, say, purple sage, that again, it's just a really drought tolerant species, and it is susceptible to a lot of root rot issues. And so if it gets a extra water in the summer, it can develop root rot, and the roots will basically die and kill the plant. So yeah, I would say those are the two main issues: root rot and yeah, the plants growing too rapidly and outgrowing their structure. So a lot of the shrub-steppe species are adaptable. I had balsam root in my yard several houses ago that I had on a drip system, and I watered it all through the summer, and it flowered actually for over a month. It was amazing. But I didn't do that for very many years, and I don't know how sustainable that would have been, because again, these are plants that are adapted to going dormant in the summer, and adding that extra water, I think, could potentially create issues with pests in the roots. So feel free to ask a follow-up question if that didn't answer it. I see a question: what do you recommend for compost? Thoughts on usage for rocks as mulch? So type of compost, I don't think really matters that much, as long as it's well composted. I wouldn't be too finicky about the type. You're mainly just trying to add some organic matter and nutrients into some degraded soil. And I have personally used rocks as mulch for most of my home landscaping. It's definitely more long-term than bark mulch, which needs to be kind of refreshed every few years. So yeah, I've used chipped basalt in a lot of my landscapes, and you have to go pretty thick with it just to keep weeds out, or put an underlayer of landscape fabric, but that can be very effective. I think that's it. Do you see any more questions?
Yeah, one more just came in. Any suggestions to keeping turkeys out?
Oh my goodness, I can't say that that's a problem that I've dealt with. But you might have to do well, turkeys fly. I was gonna say a low fence, but they could fly over that. I think fencing in general for pests, for herbivory, fencing is the best option. You could try, some of the various like noxious calling type I guess kind of like the loud noisemakers too, that I've seen people use to say keep geese. Yeah, air horns,
Right,
something
right.
loud, that they make it, for orchards.